Among luxury penthouses and marble floors, mockery turns to astonishment when hospital records surface from the past. Within the highest circles of society, a simple background check uncovers an extraordinary connection that challenges the very foundation of a powerful family. Between wealth and truth lies a story that proves destiny has a cleaning schedule of its own. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse shimmered, a glass and steel cage overlooking the glittering city. Alexandra Beaumont, in a silk dress the color of twilight, sipped champagne, the bubbles mirroring the nervous fizz in her stomach. The annual Beaumont Gala, a gilded cage indeed. Her father, Arthur, a titan of industry, radiated an unnerving calm, his smile a carefully crafted mask. He held court, his booming laughter echoing off the marble floors, a stark contrast to the simmering resentment Alexandra felt. "Darling," Arthur's voice, smooth as polished mahogany, cut through the murmur of conversation. "You're unusually quiet tonight. Enjoying yourself?" Alexandra forced a smile. "Of course, father. It's spectacular." The word tasted like ash in her mouth. The opulence felt suffocating, a gilded cage designed to keep her exactly where he wanted her. His expectations hung over her like a suffocating weight, each success measured against an impossible ideal. Later, on the balcony, the city lights a dazzling backdrop to her unease. A lone figure approached. Daniel, a journalist with eyes as warm as the summer sun, offered her a glass of water, his presence a balm to her frayed nerves. "The champagne's a bit much, isn't it?" he asked, his voice soft, understanding. Alexandra laughed, a brittle sound. "It's the only thing that seems to dull the noise." Noise! She looked at the city, its dazzling lights suddenly feeling cold and distant. The noise of expectation, of performance, of being perfect. He nodded, his gaze steady. "Sometimes, the most perfect things are the most fragile." His words, simple yet profound, planted a seed of hope in the parched earth of her discontent. A subtle shift in perspective, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of her perfect life. The gala, with its glittering facade, faded into the background as she felt the first fragile stirrings of a long-dormant desire for authenticity. The seed of her rebellion had been sown. Days bled into weeks. Alexandra, haunted by Daniel's words, found herself drawn to the city's quieter corners, dusty antique shops smelling of aged paper and forgotten stories, quiet cafes where the murmur of conversation was a comforting counterpoint to the deafening silence of her penthouse. She started small, searching online archives, driven by a nagging unease she couldn't ignore. The Beaumont name, usually synonymous with power and privilege, felt increasingly alien. One rainy afternoon, huddled in the cramped, dimly lit archives of the city hospital, she found it, a faded file, tucked away in a forgotten corner. The name Beatrice Beaumont leaped out, a name she'd never heard mentioned. The entry was brief, a hospital admission for a young woman, complications during childbirth, a discrepancy in the birth records. A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't a simple administrative error. It felt deliberate, a carefully buried secret. The air grew thick with the scent of old paper and damp dust. Alexandra's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement, a tremor of rebellion against the carefully constructed narrative of her family's flawless history. The file spoke of a past she'd never known, a past her father had meticulously concealed. It was a tiny crack in the seemingly impenetrable wall of her privileged life, but it was enough. It was a beginning. She felt a surge of determination, a defiance against the suffocating weight of expectation. This was her story now, and she would uncover the truth, even if it meant shattering the gilded cage around her. The rain outside mirrored the storm brewing within. The quiet rustle of papers felt like a conspiratorial whisper, urging her onward. This wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Alexandra felt a sense of purpose, a fierce, exhilarating freedom. The musty scent of aged paper clung to Alexandra like a second skin. She traced the faded ink of Beatrice Beaumont's name, a ghost from a past she'd never known. The hospital record felt heavy in her hands, a tangible weight of secrets. Outside, the rain hammered against the archive window, mirroring the storm of emotions raging inside her. Leaving the archives, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The city lights blurred, the familiar opulence of her world seeming strangely alien. She needed air, needed to process the seismic shift this discovery had caused. She found herself at a small, unassuming cafe, the warm aroma of coffee a welcome contrast to the chill in the air. A steaming mug warmed her hands. She watched the rain sluice down the window pane, each drop a tiny, relentless tear. "It's a lot to take in," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. A kind smile caught her attention. An elderly woman, her eyes crinkled at the corners, sat at the next table, a half-finished book beside her. "Something troubling you, dear?" she asked, her voice gentle. Alexandra hesitated, then poured out her discovery, the words tumbling out in a rush, the years of stifled emotion finally finding an outlet. The woman listened patiently, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of Alexandra's revelation. "Family secrets," the woman murmured, her voice laced with a lifetime of unspoken stories. "They have a way of clinging, don't they? Like shadows in the sunlight." A sudden clarity pierced Alexandra's confusion. It wasn't just about Beatrice. It was about the carefully constructed facade of her family, a gilded cage built on lies. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was intertwined with a nascent strength, a burgeoning resolve. This wasn't just about uncovering a secret. It was about reclaiming her own narrative. "Thank you," Alexandra said, her voice hoarse but firm. She left the cafe, the rain having subsided, leaving behind a sky streaked with the promise of dawn. The city lights no longer seemed to mock her. Instead, they held a glimmer of hope. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. The discovery of Beatrice Beaumont wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The journey to the truth had begun. The mahogany doors of the Beaumont mansion seemed to sigh shut behind Alexandra, the opulent silence amplifying the turmoil within her. The scent of lilies, usually comforting, now felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of the archive. She wandered through the echoing halls, the polished floors reflecting her uncertain face. A half-empty glass of champagne sat forgotten on a side table, its bubbles mirroring the effervescence of her apprehension. She found her father, Arthur, in his study, the room a fortress of leather and dark wood. He sat behind his imposing desk, the glow of the computer screen illuminating his stern profile. He didn't look up as she entered. "Father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to talk to you." He finally looked up, his eyes cold and assessing. "About what, Alexandra?" Another impulsive decision. His tone was laced with disdain, a familiar sting. Alexandra clenched her fists, the fragile composure she'd maintained crumbling. "About Beatrice Beaumont," she said, the name a fragile bridge across a chasm of unspoken truths. "The hospital records. They mention a connection to our family." Arthur's expression didn't change, but the subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed his unease. "Records are often inaccurate, Alexandra. You're letting your imagination run wild." He attempted a dismissive wave of his hand, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "No, father," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't imagination. This is a history, a hidden history." The tremor in her voice was undeniable, a testament to the weight of her discovery and the fear of what it might reveal. The silence that followed hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and long-buried secrets. The ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to amplify the passage of time, each tick a hammer blow against the carefully constructed walls of the Beaumont family's legacy. Alexandra stared, her heart a lead weight in her chest. The polished floors seemed to mock her with their cold indifference. Then why the lies? Why build this gilded cage? The words tasted bitter on her tongue, a harsh contrast to the lukewarm chamomile tea she hadn't touched. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the panoramic window, showcasing the city's glittering expanse. Fear, my dear. Fear for your future, for your happiness. He believed protecting you, sheltering you from the truth, was the greatest love he could offer. A single tear traced a path through the meticulously applied makeup, a stark contrast to the controlled composure she'd maintained for decades. Protection, Alexandra scoffed, the word sounding hollow, devoid of meaning. He stole my identity, my history. He built his empire on secrets, on lies. The anger clawed its way to the surface, hot and sharp. Evelyn reached across the expanse of the desk, her hand trembling slightly as it rested on Alexandra's. The cool touch of her mother's skin shocked Alexandra with its vulnerability. He loved you, Alexandra. In his own twisted, destructive way, he did. A low sob escaped Evelyn's lips, a sound so raw and full of pain that Alexandra felt a jolt of unexpected empathy. The ice wall she'd erected around herself began to crack. This wasn't the cold, distant woman she knew. This was a woman broken by a lifetime of secrets, a lifetime spent protecting a family built on sand. The lily-scented air suddenly felt suffocating. Alexandra squeezed her mother's hand, a gesture of unexpected connection. The anger simmered, replaced by a nascent understanding, a painful awareness of a shared past, a shared trauma. The fight for the truth continued, but the lines of battle had subtly shifted, etching a new landscape of empathy and a new path toward healing. The weight of the family's secrets felt less like a crushing burden and more like a shared burden, a collective pain they could now confront together. The city sprawled beneath them, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow. Alexandra stared out the panoramic window of her penthouse, the champagne flute in her hand untouched, its icy condensation mirroring the chill in her heart. The revelation hung heavy in the air, a suffocating cloud of deceit. Evelyn's confession, a lifetime spent protecting a family built on lies, a legacy forged in questionable dealings, had shattered her perception of everything she'd ever known. It wasn't just about money, Evelyn had said, her voice barely a whisper, the words lost in the vastness of the city lights. It was about survival. Your grandfather, he made choices, terrible choices, to protect us. Alexandra turned from the window, the opulent room suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The meticulously crafted perfection, the expensive art, the flawless surfaces, all of it felt like a cruel mockery. She walked to the mahogany bar. The polished would cool beneath her fingertips. She poured herself a generous measure of whiskey, the amber liquid a stark contrast to the icy champagne. Survival at whose expense? She murmured, the words catching in her throat. The burn of the whiskey was a welcome contrast to the dull ache in her chest. He built an empire on the backs of others. He destroyed lives. The weight of that realization was crushing. The Beaumont name, once a symbol of prestige and power, now felt tainted, poisoned by the dark secrets it concealed. The carefully constructed facade of her family's perfect life had crumbled, revealing a foundation of lies and exploitation. A wave of nausea washed over her. She sank onto a plush velvet chair, the softness offering little comfort. She thought of Daniel, his compassionate eyes, his unwavering support. He was the only person who seemed to understand, who didn't flinch from the truth. He'd been there through it all, a beacon of honesty in a world of deception. A surge of gratitude warmed her, a tiny flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this fight. The battle for truth was far from over, but for the first time, the fight didn't feel so utterly hopeless. She picked up her phone, the cool glass a momentary solace against the heat of her emotions. She needed to talk to Daniel, to share the burden, to find strength in their shared fight for truth. The future remained uncertain, shrouded in a fog of moral complexities, but a new determination took root, fueled by the bitter taste of betrayal and the tentative bloom of newfound resilience. The mahogany bar felt cold beneath Alexandra's trembling hand. The scent of old wood and expensive liquor did little to soothe the turmoil churning within her. Evelyn's confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid New York night pressing against the penthouse windows. Each glittering cityscape light seemed to mock her fragile composure. "It wasn't about greed, Alexandra," Evelyn had whispered, her voice raspy with age and regret. "Your grandfather, he believed he was protecting us. He saw it as a necessary evil." Alexandra scoffed, the sound brittle and devoid of conviction. "Protecting us? By exploiting others? By building a fortune on the suffering of innocent people?" The words felt raw, tearing through the carefully constructed veneer of her upbringing. The weight of inherited privilege suddenly felt crushing, a gilded cage built on a foundation of lies. The champagne, still untouched, felt like a symbol of her family's superficial celebrations, a cruel jest against the harsh reality she now faced. She slammed the flute onto the bar, the crystal shattering into a million fragments, mirroring the disintegration of her carefully built world. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another and another, until a torrent of grief threatened to consume her. The opulent room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The plush velvet chair, once a symbol of comfort, offered no solace. She needed Daniel. His unwavering support was a lifeline in this storm. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling in her haste. The cool glass felt strangely comforting against her trembling hands. The dial tone echoed in the luxurious silence, a stark contrast to the chaos within her. Each ring felt like an eternity, stretching the tension to a breaking point. Finally, he answered, his voice a soothing balm against her raw emotions. "Alexandra, what's wrong?" His concern was evident, his voice laced with a gentle urgency. Alexandra's voice cracked. It's worse than I imagined, Daniel. Much worse." She couldn't articulate the depth of her despair, the overwhelming weight of the truth. She could only sob, her words broken and incomplete, yet brimming with the raw pain of betrayal and disillusionment. The city lights blurred through her tears, a hazy backdrop to her emotional implosion. The fight for truth had only just begun, and it already felt like an insurmountable battle. Daniel arrived, the scent of rain and city grime clinging to his coat, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of the Beaumont penthouse. He knelt beside Alexandra, his hand gently resting on hers, a silent reassurance in the face of her devastation. The shattered remnants of the champagne flute lay scattered on the polished mahogany bar, a testament to the fragility of her world. "Tell me," he urged softly, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm raging within her. Alexandra's sobs subsided into choked breaths, her gaze fixed on the glittering city lights, now shimmering like distant stars through a veil of tears. "It wasn't just a necessary evil," she whispered, her voice thick with despair. "It was systematic. My grandfather. He orchestrated a series of fraudulent land deals, exploited vulnerable communities." She paused, struggling to articulate the horror she'd uncovered. "He built this empire on lies, Daniel, on the suffering of others." The weight of revelation pressed down on her, suffocating. The silk of her dress, once a symbol of luxury, felt like a suffocating shroud. Each carefully chosen detail of her life, each meticulously crafted moment, felt tainted, poisoned by the truth. Daniel's presence was her only solace, his silent empathy a lifeline in the ocean of her grief. "And Evelyn," she continued, her voice barely a murmur. She knew. She always knew. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and shared pain. The city hummed outside, a constant reminder of the world spinning on, oblivious to the collapse of her carefully constructed reality. Daniel squeezed her hand. "It's not your fault, Alexandra," he said gently, his voice firm despite the tremor in her own. "None of this is your fault." But the words offered little comfort. The inheritance of guilt, the weight of a legacy built on deception, felt crushing. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief, anger, and a flicker of something else, determination. I can't let this stand, Daniel," she declared, her voice stronger now, though still trembling. "I have to do something." The city lights, previously symbols of superficial glamour, now seemed to burn with a different kind of intensity, reflecting the fire that had ignited within her. The fight for truth had begun, and this time, she wasn't alone. The shattering of her world had also revealed a strength she never knew she possessed. A strength fueled by grief, anger, and a newfound resolve to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The fight for truth, for justice, for her own identity, was just beginning. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Arthur Beaumont's iron control, now seemed to tremble under the weight of Alexandra's accusation. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars hung heavy in the air, a suffocating perfume of deceit. "You knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the frantic drumming of her heart. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the already hazy details of the opulent study. Arthur, his face a mask of controlled fury, simply stared. His usual calm demeanor had shattered, revealing the brittle man beneath. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words seemingly caught in his throat. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each chime a mocking reminder of time's relentless march. Alexandra's gaze drifted to the family portraits lining the walls, their smiling faces now twisted caricatures of the lies she'd uncovered. The gilded cage, once a symbol of privilege, now felt like a prison. "It wasn't about building a legacy," she choked out, her voice rising in a crescendo of pain and anger. "It was about concealing a monstrous secret, wasn't it?" He finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "You don't understand the sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" Alexandra laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You call exploiting the vulnerable a sacrifice? Ruining lives to build your empire?" She rose from her chair, the movement sharp and desperate. The Persian rug beneath her feet felt plush yet alien, a stark reminder of the chasm that now separated her from her father. He stood as well, his height suddenly menacing. "This is about more than just money, Alexandra," he said, his voice strained. "It's about our family, our reputation. Reputation built on lies." She spat, the word echoing in the cavernous room. "A reputation built on the backs of others." She turned, her back to him, the sheer weight of the revelation pressing down on her. Outside, the city lights twinkled, indifferent to the tempest raging within the Beaumont penthouse. She needed air, needed escape, needed Daniel. The thought of his quiet strength, his unwavering empathy, offered a sliver of solace amidst the storm. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the carefully applied makeup. The fight had just begun, and the weight of truth felt heavier than she could have ever imagined. The city sprawled beneath her, a glittering tapestry of lights that offered no solace. Alexandra stood on her penthouse balcony, the cool night air a stark contrast to the burning rage within. The scent of expensive jasmine from the meticulously tended garden below did little to soothe her. The revelation had hit her like a physical blow, a carefully constructed lineage, a legacy built on the suffering of others. It wasn't just wealth. It was a deliberate, generations-long deception. Her phone vibrated in her hand. It was Daniel. She hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. How could she possibly explain this to him? How could she even begin to process it herself? "Alexandra, are you all right?" Daniel's voice, calm and reassuring, reached her through the phone. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's worse than I imagined." "Tell me," he urged gently. His voice was a lifeline, a fragile connection to a reality outside the suffocating world of lies she now inhabited. She recounted the discovery, the chilling details of her family's true origins, the exploitation, the cover-up. She spoke in a rush, her words tumbling over each other, fueled by a desperate need to unload the burden she carried. The city lights blurred through her tears. "They stole from others, built their fortune on pain," she finished, her voice breaking. Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the distant city sounds. "I'm here," Daniel said simply, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm. I'm here for you. She felt a tear trace a cold path down her cheek. The luxury penthouse, the breathtaking view, the meticulously crafted life she had always known. It all felt hollow, a grotesque mockery of the truth. This wasn't just about the Beaumonts. It was about justice, about the victims whose lives had been sacrificed to build this empire of deceit. A new determination hardened her resolve. The anger was still there, a burning ember in her chest, but alongside it was something else, a fierce, unwavering resolve. She wouldn't let them get away with it. Not this time. The fight had indeed begun, and she would fight for the truth, even if it meant losing everything. The weight of it all was immense, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she would not be silenced. She would uncover the truth completely, and then she would decide what to do next. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Alexandra's trembling hands. The air in Arthur's study, usually thick with the scent of expensive cigars, was now heavy with the silence of a shattered truth. She clutched the faded hospital records, the brittle paper a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Outside, the city lights twinkled, oblivious to the storm raging within her. It's not just about money, is it, Father? Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of generations of lies. Arthur, his face a mask of controlled fury, remained seated, his usually impeccable posture slumped slightly. What are you implying, Alexandra? I'm implying that the Beaumont fortune wasn't built on success, but on theft, she said, the word hanging in the air, thick and acrid. On the suffering of others. He didn't deny it. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second a hammer blow against her already fragile composure. The ornate clock, a family heirloom, felt like a cruel reminder of their meticulously crafted deception. There were circumstances, he finally mumbled, his voice raspy. Things you wouldn't understand. I understand suffering, Father. I understand betrayal, Alexandra retorted, her voice rising. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the intricate details of the room. These records, they prove it. They prove you knew. Mother knew. And you all let it continue. She felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, but beneath it, a deeper, colder despair took hold. The elegant Persian rug beneath her feet felt suddenly alien, repulsive, stained with the unseen blood of countless victims. He rose, his movements stiff and jerky, a stark contrast to his usual composed demeanor. This changes nothing, Alexandra. The past is the past. No, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The past is a burden, a stain that can't be washed away with money. She turned, the heavy weight of the records a physical manifestation of her family's dark secret. The gilded cage, once a symbol of privilege, now felt like a prison, the bars forged from deceit and built upon the suffering of others. Leaving the study, she felt the cool night air on her face, a small solace in the face of overwhelming betrayal. But even the night sky, normally so calming, seemed to reflect the storm within, a bleak and unforgiving expanse mirroring the devastation she carried within her heart. The fight had only just begun. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting presence in Evelyn's sun-drenched conservatory, now felt suffocating. Alexandra sat rigidly on a wicker chair, the intricate carvings digging into her skin, mirroring the sharp edges of her grief. Evelyn, her mother, sat opposite, her usual composed elegance replaced by a fragility that both surprised and saddened Alexandra. The morning light, filtering through stained glass windows, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the stark contrast between their opulent surroundings and the raw emotion hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't just Arthur, Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the greenhouse's ventilation system. It was a legacy, a burden passed down through generations. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, the delicate fabric a stark contrast to the weight of her confession. Alexandra stared at her mother, her heart a cold knot of betrayal and dawning understanding. A burden built on lies? She asked, her voice trembling. Evelyn nodded, her gaze distant, lost in the painful memories. Your grandfather, he made a terrible choice. A choice that tainted everything that followed. And Arthur, he believed he was protecting us, protecting the family name. But he was only perpetuating the cycle. The weight of those words settled upon Alexandra like a physical blow. The glittering facade of her family, the meticulously crafted image of success and privilege, crumbled around her, revealing a foundation built on deception and suffering. The intricate mosaic tile floor, usually so beautiful, now seemed cold and unforgiving. So all this wealth, Alexandra gestured around the conservatory, her voice laced with disbelief and a deep well of sorrow. It's all blood money? Evelyn closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her weathered cheek. Yes, Alexandra, it is. The silence that followed was heavy, a silence filled with years of unspoken secrets and the crushing weight of inherited guilt. The hum of the ventilation system felt almost mocking, a relentless reminder of the stifling air of deceit that had enveloped her family for generations. Alexandra felt the first hesitant tendrils of empathy reach out towards her mother, a fragile bridge across the chasm of betrayal. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, amidst the ruins, something new could be built. The cleaning schedule of destiny, it seemed, was about to begin its work. The dusty attic air hung thick with the scent of mothballs and forgotten memories. Alexandra, her fingers tracing the chipped paint of a forgotten trunk, felt a tremor of unease. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed lace and brittle photographs, lay a leather-bound journal. Its pages, brittle with age, whispered secrets. Each entry, penned in a spidery hand, revealed a meticulously documented history, far different from the polished narrative her father had spun. The journal detailed the family's arrival in the city, not as triumphant entrepreneurs, but as desperate immigrants, clinging to a sliver of hope. It spoke of ruthless ambition, of deals struck in shadowed alleyways, of compromises made that stained their hands with something far darker than mere ambition. Alexandra read of a clandestine affair, a hidden child, a web of deceit woven through generations. Her breath hitched. This wasn't the story of a self-made dynasty. It was a tale of survival built on lies. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the faded ink. The elegant penthouses, the shimmering charity galas, the effortless grace of her family. It all crumbled like a house of cards. A wave of nausea washed over her. The opulent marble floors now felt like a cold, hard prison. She slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing in the suffocating stillness of the attic. The weight of revelation pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Betrayal wasn't just a word. It was a physical presence, a tangible weight crushing her spirit. The meticulously crafted image of her family, a tapestry woven with threads of lies, unraveled, leaving behind only raw, jagged edges of truth. Alexandra sank to her knees, the dust of forgotten years coating her hands, mirroring the dust settling on the shattered fragments of her world. The cleaning schedule of destiny, it seemed, was a brutal and unforgiving process. The mahogany dining table, usually gleaming under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, felt cold and oppressive. Alexandra sat across from her Aunt Genevieve, the family matriarch, a woman whose icy demeanor had always been a fortress. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting fragrance, now felt cloying, suffocating. You've made a terrible mistake, Alexandra. Genevieve's voice was sharp, brittle as winter ice. Her perfectly manicured hands, usually clasped elegantly, now drummed a restless rhythm on the polished wood. This investigation, it's destroying everything. Alexandra met her aunt's gaze, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. The weight of the journal's revelations, the shattering of her carefully constructed reality, pressed down on her like a physical burden. It's not destroying anything, Aunt Genevieve. It's revealing the truth. Truth, Genevieve scoffed, a harsh sound that echoed in the cavernous room. Your father built this family, this empire. He sacrificed everything for us. And you dare to question his legacy. Alexandra swallowed, the lump in her throat constricting her breath. He sacrificed his integrity, Aunt Genevieve. He built it on lies. Genevieve leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. Lies? You're basing this on a dusty old journal, filled with hearsay and half-truths. Your father's memory deserves more respect than this. It's not hearsay, Alexandra's voice trembled, but she held her gaze. It's documented. It's the truth. And it's a truth that impacts all of us. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The weight of generations of secrets hung in the air, a suffocating blanket of betrayal. Alexandra felt the familiar sting of tears welling in her eyes, the pain a sharp, physical ache in her chest. But she refused to yield. The truth, however painful, was her anchor, her strength in this storm of family deception. The fight for authenticity, for her own identity, had only just begun. The marble floors, once symbols of luxury, now felt like the cold, hard ground of a battlefield. The ornate Louis XVI chair groaned under Alexandra's weight as she stared out at the glittering city spread below. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of opulent comfort, felt like a gilded cage. The champagne flute in her hand remained untouched, its bubbles mirroring the turmoil churning within her. Genevieve's words echoed in her ears, lies, hearsay, half-truths, a cruel counterpoint to the irrefutable evidence she held. A sharp knock on the door startled her. It was Daniel, his concerned face etched with worry. The soft light from the hallway illuminated the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea a comforting presence in the tense atmosphere. "You haven't touched your champagne," he observed, his voice low and gentle. He placed the mug on the table, its warmth a stark contrast to the chilling revelations she'd faced. Alexandra managed a weak smile. It lost its appeal. She swirled the untouched liquid, the ice clinking softly, a melancholic soundtrack to her inner turmoil. "Genevieve, she won't believe me. She sees only the legacy, not the lies beneath it." Daniel sat beside her, his hand briefly resting on hers, a silent offering of support. "She's blinded by the past, by the carefully constructed narrative her family has always maintained," he said softly. "But you're not alone in this, Alexandra. I've seen the documents. I believe you." His words, simple yet profound, were a lifeline in the sea of doubt engulfing her. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of despair, but of relief, of validation. The weight of her burden seemed momentarily lighter, shared. "There's more," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "More than just the family's dubious origins. There are connections, to other families, to businesses. It's a web, Daniel, a tangled web of deceit spanning generations." He nodded, his expression grim. "We need to be careful. Exposing this could have devastating consequences, not just for your family, but for many others involved." The city lights twinkled below, a breathtaking panorama. Yet all Alexandra could see were the shadows of the past, the ghosts of secrets, the faces of those she loved, now forever changed by the truth. The fight had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The luxury, the comfort, the facade of perfection, it all felt hollow now, a fragile shell masking a dark and disturbing reality. But with Daniel at her side, she felt a flicker of hope, a renewed strength to face the coming storm. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Alexandra's trembling hands. The scent of lilies, usually a soothing presence, now felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of betrayal clinging to her tongue. Genevieve, her aunt, sat opposite, her face a mask of controlled fury, her perfectly sculpted nails drumming a frantic rhythm on the polished surface. The city lights, a shimmering tapestry beyond the panoramic window, offered no solace. "You're delusional, Alexandra," Genevieve hissed, her voice laced with icy contempt. This fabricated history, it's absurd." Alexandra swallowed, the lump in her throat a physical manifestation of her fear and grief. "It's not fabricated, Genevieve. The hospital records, the financial statements, they're all real. She pushed a file across the table, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the trembling of her hands. Genevieve didn't touch it. Your father, he's manipulated you. He always was a master manipulator. Her gaze, sharp and accusing, pierced Alexandra. This is a desperate attempt to gain control, to undermine the family. A bitter laugh escaped Alexandra. Control? He's controlled everything for decades. This is about uncovering the truth, about breaking free from the lies he's built his empire on. Tears welled, blurring the already hazy image of her aunt's face. The weight of the deception, the years of carefully constructed illusions crumbling around her, threatened to overwhelm her. Genevieve rose, her silhouette sharp against the city's glittering backdrop. You'll regret this, Alexandra. You'll destroy everything we've built. She paused, her voice softening slightly, a hint of vulnerability peeking through her carefully maintained facade. This family, it's all we have. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, with years of carefully maintained secrets and simmering resentments. Alexandra saw a flicker of pain in Genevieve's eyes, a fleeting moment of vulnerability before the mask of icy control was firmly back in place. It was a glimpse into the woman beneath the layers of wealth and privilege, a woman damaged by the same lies that had poisoned Alexandra's life. Alexandra remained seated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The truth was a heavy burden, a bitter pill to swallow, but the alternative, a life lived in the shadow of lies, was unbearable. She knew with chilling certainty that the fight had only just begun, and the battle for truth would be long and arduous. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of security and belonging, now felt like a battleground. The glittering city lights a cold, uncaring witness to the unraveling of her family's carefully constructed reality. The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor as Alexandra confronted her uncle, Charles. His study, usually a sanctuary of hushed whispers and clandestine deals, felt suffocating. The air hung thick with the scent of old leather and unspoken accusations. Charles, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, sat rigidly behind his massive mahogany desk, a fortress of denial. "This is madness, Alexandra," he began, his voice a low rumble, the words vibrating with controlled anger. "You're tearing the family apart." He steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering, a stark contrast to the tremor in his voice. Alexandra felt a familiar wave of nausea, the opulent surroundings suddenly feeling claustrophobic. "It's not madness, Uncle Charles," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. The weight of the truth felt like a physical burden, pressing down on her chest. "It's the truth. And the truth is, our family's legacy is built on a lie." He scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "Lies are the currency of power, Alexandra. You wouldn't understand." He gestured dismissively, his hand brushing against a framed photograph of his late father, a man whose eyes held the same chilling emptiness as his own. Alexandra's gaze flickered to the picture. A lifetime of carefully constructed facades and cleverly hidden truths reflected back at her. "I understand more than you think," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "I understand the sacrifices, the compromises, the lies. I understand the damage they've inflicted, generation after generation." She watched as the color drained from his face, a fleeting vulnerability breaking through his carefully cultivated composure. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner, each beat a hammer blow against his carefully constructed defenses. He rose, pacing the length of his imposing desk. "This will destroy us, Alexandra. You know that, don't you?" The fear in his eyes was undeniable, a stark contrast to his usual veneer of control. He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders slumped, revealing a weariness she had never seen before. The weight of generations of deceit seemed to have finally crushed him. Alexandra felt a pang of sympathy, a fleeting moment of compassion amidst the tidal wave of betrayal. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. But maybe destruction is the only way to build something new. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between the crumbling past and the uncertain future. The battle for truth was far from over. But in that moment, Alexandra found a newfound strength, fueled by the courage to confront the ghosts of her family's past. The penthouse suite felt colder than usual, the opulent furnishings offering no comfort. Alexandra stared out at the city sprawling below, a million glittering lights mocking her solitude. The weight of the revelations pressed down, a suffocating blanket of betrayal. The sharp scent of lilies, usually a calming presence, now felt cloying, a reminder of the artificial perfection she'd always believed in. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a cold trail in its wake. She picked up her phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning in her throat. Daniel's name flickered on the screen, a lifeline in the swirling vortex of her pain. Hesitantly, she pressed call. "Alexandra? What is it?" Daniel's voice, usually warm and reassuring, held a worried edge. I don't know where to turn," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's all too much." He didn't push for details, simply offering gentle words of support. His voice, a steady presence amidst the storm raging inside her, was the only anchor she had left. They talked for hours, the city lights blurring into an indistinguishable mass as she poured out her heart. He listened patiently, his words carefully chosen, offering solace without minimizing her pain. The conversation ended with a silent understanding. She wasn't alone in this battle, but the battle itself felt insurmountable. The chasm between her past and present yawned before her, a gaping wound that refused to heal. The opulent apartment, once a symbol of security and belonging, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping her in a suffocating reality. The family she had always known, the family she had loved, was gone, replaced by a web of lies and deceit, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The path ahead remained shrouded in shadows, but in the quiet solace of Daniel's unwavering support, a tiny spark of hope ignited. The fight, she realized, was far from over. The battle for truth had just begun. The mahogany door to Arthur's study felt heavy, imbued with the weight of unspoken secrets. Alexandra hesitated, the polished surface reflecting her own strained face. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco hung heavy in the air, a familiar aroma now tainted with betrayal. Inside, Arthur sat behind his imposing desk, the city lights painting a dramatic silhouette against his sharp profile. He didn't look up as she entered. "Father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. I need to understand." He finally met her gaze, his eyes cold and calculating. "Understand what, Alexandra? That your fanciful notions are disrupting a carefully constructed life. The hospital records," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The inconsistencies, the lies." He chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Lies? My dear girl, you have an overactive imagination. Sometimes, the truth is far more mundane than your elaborate fantasies." His words struck her like icy blows. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the luxurious surroundings. The opulent study, once a symbol of security, now felt like a prison. The weight of years of deception, of carefully crafted illusions, threatened to crush her. "Mundane?" she repeated, her voice laced with anguish. "This isn't about fantasies, Father. It's about my identity, my history, my very being." He leaned back in his chair, his expression unyielding. "Your identity is Beaumont. That's all that matters." The statement, so simple yet so profoundly cruel, pushed Alexandra over the edge. She felt a rage build within her, a fierce determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The carefully constructed facade of her family was crumbling, revealing a dark, disturbing reality. The fight, she realized, was indeed far from over. The battle for her own truth had just begun, and she was ready to fight. The weight of Arthur's words hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid New York summer. Alexandra stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The city lights, once a dazzling backdrop to her gilded cage, now seemed mocking, their brilliance highlighting the stark darkness of her father's denial. Tears streamed down her face, hot and stinging, a stark contrast to the cool marble floor beneath her bare feet. She fled the study, the scent of old leather and betrayal clinging to her like a shroud. The grand staircase, usually a symbol of her family's stature, felt treacherous under her trembling feet. Each step echoed the shattering of her carefully constructed reality. Reaching her room, she collapsed onto the plush silk sheets, the softness a cruel mockery of the turmoil within. The panoramic view of Central Park, usually a source of comfort, offered no solace. The world outside seemed distant, unreal, a jarring contrast to the raw pain consuming her. Days bled into weeks. Alexandra withdrew, isolating herself within the confines of her penthouse, the opulence surrounding her feeling increasingly oppressive. She spent hours poring over old photographs, faded family portraits that now seemed to whisper secrets. Each familiar face, once loved and trusted, now held a layer of suspicion, a hint of the unspoken. One evening, a hesitant knock on her door broke the silence. It was Daniel. He carried a steaming mug, the faint scent of chamomile tea cutting through the heavy air of despair. He didn't speak, simply sat beside her on the vast bed, his presence a quiet comfort in the storm raging within her. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. All of it, every carefully constructed word, every carefully orchestrated event. A lie. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "I know," he said softly. "Narrative. They can't accept being exposed." He nodded, his expression grim. "They'll throw everything they have at you. Money, influence, even fabricated evidence." He slid a thick file across the table, the paper cool against her fingers. "This is what they've dug up. Mostly mudslinging, but there are a few concerning elements." Alexandra opened the file, her breath catching in her throat. A photograph, grainy and faded, showed a younger Arthur, his face partially obscured, at a protest outside a factory. Beneath it, a scrawled note, "Union busting, Beaumont Industries." A chill snaked down her spine. This was new. This was dangerous. This changes things," she whispered, the words barely audible above the low hum of the city outside. The weight of the past, her family's carefully constructed lies, felt heavier than ever. The fight wasn't just about justice. It was about survival. Her own. Daniel reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch, grounding and reassuring, was a lifeline in the storm. "We'll face this together, Alex. We always will." His gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. The warmth in his eyes, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness, offered her a renewed sense of strength. The battle was brutal, but she wasn't alone. The fight continued. The legal team, a phalanx of sharp-suited figures, buzzed around Alexandra like agitated wasps. The air in the sterile conference room tasted of stale coffee and fear. Each document slammed on the mahogany table felt like a personal attack, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the tremor in Alexandra's hands. Daniel sat beside her, his hand a silent anchor amidst the swirling chaos. The accusations, financial impropriety, conspiracy, even perjury were piling up, each one a carefully aimed dart at her already fragile composure. "They're playing dirty, Alex," Daniel murmured, his voice low and reassuring. He squeezed her hand, the simple gesture a lifeline in the maelstrom of legal jargon. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a relentless soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Alexandra swallowed, the dryness in her throat mirroring the hollowness in her chest. The photograph, Arthur at the union-busting protest, haunted her. It wasn't just about exposing a lie anymore. It was about confronting a legacy of violence, a history meticulously concealed beneath layers of gilded charm. "They're trying to discredit me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of hushed conversations. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were shadowed with exhaustion and a deep-seated weariness. They're using my past, my family's past, against me. Daniel's gaze was unwavering. He knew the weight of the revelations, the burden of truth she carried. They're afraid, Alex. Afraid of what you've uncovered. Afraid of what the truth will do to their carefully constructed world. He leaned closer, his voice a soft counterpoint to the harsh reality of the situation. But you're stronger than they think. You have the truth on your side. His words were a balm, a gentle reminder of the strength she sometimes forgot she possessed. The scent of his cologne, a familiar blend of sandalwood and something subtly spicy, offered a momentary solace. Despite the crushing pressure, a flicker of resolve ignited within her. The fight wasn't just for justice. It was for her own survival, for the reclamation of her identity. The fight was for her truth. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Alexandra like a second skin. The fluorescent hum of the hospital lights seemed to mock her exhaustion. She stared at the faded photograph, Arthur's youthful face a stark contrast to the stern, controlled man she knew. He stood amidst a throng of angry protesters, his young face alight with something she couldn't quite name. Passion? Zeal? Or something far darker? It's not just about the money, is it? Daniel's voice was a gentle hand on her shoulder, pulling her back from the vortex of her memories. Alexandra shook her head, tears blurring the image. It's about everything. About who they are, who I thought they were. The weight of the deception pressed down on her, a crushing burden of lies and half-truths. Daniel's thumb gently stroked her arm. They tried to bury this, Alex, to erase it, but it's still here. This photo. It's a crack in their carefully constructed facade, and it's widening. He pointed to a faint inscription on the back of the photo. Union busting, Beaumont Textiles, 1978. The date hit her like a physical blow. My grandfather, he was involved, she whispered, the words raw with pain and betrayal. The opulent penthouse, the shimmering gala, the carefully curated image of her family. It all crumbled, leaving behind the bitter taste of ash. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Each tick a tiny hammer blow against her resolve. The weight of her family's legacy, a legacy built on broken promises and silenced voices, pressed upon her, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate her. Yet, in the midst of the despair, a spark of defiance flickered. This wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about the countless others whose lives had been touched by her family's actions. It's bigger than us, isn't it? She said, her voice gaining strength, a newfound steel replacing the tremor. She looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. This fight, it's for them too. A grim smile played on her lips. And I'm not backing down. The fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a surging tide of righteous anger. The fight had just begun. The news exploded. Headlines screamed of Beaumont family scandals, their gilded cage now a shattered birdcage. Alexandra, her face pale but resolute, watched the rolling news coverage from her sparsely furnished apartment, a stark contrast to the opulent penthouse she'd once called home. The city lights, usually a glittering backdrop to her life, now felt like a cold, indifferent audience. The scent of stale coffee clung to the air, a grim reminder of sleepless nights spent poring over documents, strategizing with Daniel. Daniel sat beside her, his hand resting reassuringly on hers. They're trying to discredit you, Alex. Smear campaigns, legal threats. It's brutal. His voice was soft, but his eyes held a steely determination that mirrored her own. Alexandra nodded, her gaze fixed on the television screen. A lawyer's face filled the frame, his words slick with legal jargon, attempting to minimize the Beaumont family's culpability. A wave of nausea washed over her, the familiar metallic taste of anxiety coating her tongue. They're not going to win, she said, her voice a low, unwavering murmur, more to reassure herself than Daniel. We have the evidence. The truth is on our side. That night, the quiet hum of her refrigerator was almost deafening in the small apartment. The silence, once a welcome refuge, now felt oppressive. The weight of the legal battles, the media scrutiny, the betrayal of those she'd once considered family, it all crashed down on her. She felt a familiar ache in her chest, a hollow emptiness that no amount of coffee could fill. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. Daniel, sensing her despair, pulled her close, his embrace a silent promise of support. He didn't try to offer false hope or empty platitudes. He simply held her, letting her grieve, letting her feel the full force of her loss. She buried her face in his shoulder, the rough texture of his shirt a comfort against her trembling body. The scent of his aftershave, usually a distraction, grounded her, a familiar anchor in this storm of upheaval. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet chaos of her temporary life, Alexandra felt a different kind of strength bloom within her. A strength born not of privilege, but of resilience. The fight wasn't just for justice. It was for her own survival, her own rebirth. And she would not be broken. The fluorescent lights of the lawyer's office hummed, a counterpoint to the low thrum of anxiety vibrating in Alexandra's chest. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale fear. Mr. Harding, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, presented a mountain of paperwork. They're contesting every point, Miss Beaumont. Their legal team is aggressive. Alexandra's fingers traced the worn rim of her coffee cup, the bitter taste of familiar companion. I expected as much, but we have the evidence. The hospital records, the financial statements. Daniel, seated beside her, squeezed her hand. His touch was a grounding force in the swirling chaos. We do, and we won't back down. His voice, usually so reassuring, held a note of strained resolve. Days bled into weeks. The relentless media scrutiny felt like a physical weight, each headline a fresh wound. Alexandra found herself retreating further into herself, the vibrant spark of defiance dimming under the relentless pressure. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, the nights filled with the ghosts of her past and the anxieties of her present. The small apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a cage. One evening, huddled under a threadbare blanket, Alexandra confessed her doubts to Daniel. I'm starting to wonder, was it all worth it? The price? It's so high. Her voice cracked, revealing the depth of her despair. Daniel pulled her close, his embrace a silent refutation of her self-doubt. Alexandra, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Remember why you started. Remember the injustice, the lies, the people who suffered because of their greed. This fight isn't just about you anymore. It's about them. His words, simple yet profound, rekindled a flickering ember of resolve within her. The fight wasn't just about exposing a family secret. It was about justice, about accountability, about the possibility of a future where truth could prevail over power. The weight of the world still pressed down on her, but within that weight, she found a new strength, a steely determination forged in the fires of adversity. The scent of Daniel's cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something subtly spicy, became a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She was fighting and she would not give up. The stale air of the courtroom hung heavy, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and simmering animosity. Alexandra, perched on the edge of her seat, felt the familiar tremor in her hands. The lawyer's words, sharp and precise, sliced through the hushed silence. Each syllable felt like a tiny hammer blow against her already fractured spirit. Outside, the relentless city hummed, a discordant symphony to the legal battle unfolding within. She stole a glance at Daniel, his face etched with concern, his hand subtly resting on hers under the table. The simple gesture was a lifeline, a silent affirmation of his unwavering support. Yet, even his presence couldn't completely quell the gnawing doubt that had taken root in her heart. Was she doing the right thing? The cost, the relentless pressure, the isolation, the erosion of her own self-belief felt almost unbearable. Later, in the cramped solitude of their apartment, the silence pressed down on her like a physical weight. The scent of rain on the city streets drifted in through the open window, a mournful counterpoint to her inner turmoil. Daniel found her curled on the sofa, her eyes fixed on a flickering streetlight. "They're relentless," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the city's low drone. He sat beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. The warmth of his touch was a fragile comfort in the chilling expanse of her despair. "I know, sweetheart, but we're not giving up." "But what if we lose?" she murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "What if everything I've done was for nothing?" He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the delicate curve of her jawline. "Alexandra," he said, his voice low and steady, "look at me. You haven't done this for nothing. You've shone a light on the darkness. You've given a voice to the voiceless. And that, my love, is more valuable than any victory in court." His words, simple yet profound, pierced through her self-doubt, offering a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The city lights, reflected in her tear-filled eyes, seemed to hold a promise of a brighter dawn. The fight continued, but within the storm, a quiet resilience was taking hold. The mahogany table in the opulent boardroom felt cold beneath Alexandra's trembling hands. The air, thick with the scent of old money and impending doom, crackled with unspoken accusations. Arthur, her father, sat rigidly across from her, his face a mask of controlled fury. Evelyn, her mother, watched from the sidelines, her eyes filled with a weary sadness that mirrored Alexandra's own exhaustion. This charade must end." Arthur's voice, low and dangerous, cut through the silence. His words, like shards of ice, pierced Alexandra's defenses. She'd expected anger, but this controlled rage was far more chilling. Alexandra met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a fierce determination. "It's not a charade, father. It's the truth." "Truth?" he scoffed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Your so-called truth is destroying everything we've built." Evelyn's soft sigh broke the tension, a fragile sound in the opulent chamber. "Arthur," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "perhaps we should listen." He cut her off with a wave of his hand, silencing her with the weight of his authority. The gesture, usually commanding, felt broken, revealing the cracks in his carefully constructed persona. The years of deception, the weight of his lies, seemed to visibly age him in that moment. Alexandra watched, her heart aching with a complicated mix of anger and pity. The woman she'd once revered as strong and unyielding was now just a shadow, a victim of the very system her husband had built. "Listen to what, Evelyn? To the lies my daughter has spun? The lies that will ruin us all." Arthur's voice cracked, the carefully maintained composure finally crumbling. The mask slipped, revealing the fear beneath. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of their family. Alexandra saw then, with chilling clarity, the extent of the damage she had wrought, but also the unshakable truth that had driven her to this point. The fight was far from over, but within the cold, unforgiving space of the boardroom, a seed of something else was planted, a fragile hope for redemption, hidden amidst the ruins. The courtroom buzzed, a hive of hushed whispers and rustling papers. Alexandra sat stiffly, the polished mahogany of the witness stand cold beneath her palms. The scent of expensive perfume warred with the acrid tang of fear clinging to the air. Her lawyer, a seasoned veteran with kind eyes, squeezed her hand reassuringly before retreating. Arthur, his face a landscape of controlled rage, glared from the plaintiff's table. His gaze, once a source of terrifying power, now held a flicker of something else, of vulnerability, perhaps, or the chilling realization of impending defeat. "Ms. Beaumont," the judge's voice, crisp and impartial, cut through the tension. "You maintain your accusations against your family are truthful?" Alexandra swallowed, her throat dry. The weight of the past few months pressed down on her. The relentless media scrutiny, the legal battles, the isolation. Yet, a newfound strength pulsed within her, a fire forged in the crucible of betrayal. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "Every single one." The ensuing cross-examination was brutal. Arthur's lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, tore at her testimony, seeking inconsistencies, planting doubt. He threw her own words back at her, twisting her vulnerabilities into weapons. Each question was a blow, yet with every parry, Alexandra's resolve only hardened. She'd spent months preparing, poring over documents, steeling herself against the onslaught. The truth, once a fragile seedling, had blossomed into a sturdy oak, rooted deep in the bedrock of her conviction. Later, outside the courtroom, Daniel waited, his face etched with worry. He pulled her into a hug, the warmth of his embrace a stark contrast to the icy chill of the legal battle. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They couldn't break you." His words were a lifeline, a reminder of the support she had, the love that anchored her in the storm. The warmth of his touch, the gentle pressure of his hand, eased the trembling in her limbs. She leaned against him, the weight of the day finally lifting, replaced by the quiet strength of his unwavering belief. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, surrounded by the cacophony of the city, she felt a flicker of hope, a promise of justice, and the unshakable certainty that she had done the right thing. The courtroom's oppressive silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each second a hammer blow against Alexandra's already frayed nerves. The judge's gavel, when it finally fell, sounded like a death knell. Guilty. Arthur Beaumont, found guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The victory felt hollow. Alexandra's chest ached, a raw emptiness replacing the adrenaline-fueled fight. The weight of what she'd done, the cost of exposing her family's secrets, settled heavily upon her. Later, in Daniel's small, book-lined apartment, the scent of old paper and brewing coffee did little to soothe her. Rain lashed against the window panes, mirroring the storm raging inside her. Daniel, sensing her distress, simply sat beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared space of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the emotional battlefield they'd both traversed. "It's over," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that cut through the tempest outside. Alexandra managed a weak smile. "Is it, though?" she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. The victory felt Pyrrhic. The chasm between her and her family remained, a vast, unbridgeable gulf carved by years of lies and betrayal. The legal victory felt small compared to the emotional wreckage. He pulled her closer, his embrace a haven. "You did what was right," he murmured, his voice a balm against her raw wounds. "You faced a monstrous truth and fought for justice. That's not hollow, Alexandra. That's heroic." His words, simple yet profound, offered a glimmer of solace. But the scars remained, deep and raw. The image of her mother, Evelyn's face etched with a heartbreaking blend of regret and defiance, played on repeat in her mind. The understanding they'd found in the midst of the chaos offered a fragile hope, yet the rupture was undeniable. The future, once clear, now felt shrouded in an uncertain mist, a path yet to be forged. The fight for justice had been won, but the fight for healing had only just begun. The penthouse, once a symbol of her family's gilded cage, now felt like a mausoleum. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon sun slanting through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the untouched champagne flutes and half-eaten canapes from the last disastrous party. Alexandra traced the rim of a crystal glass, the chill seeping into her numb fingers. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock echoing the relentless beat of her own heart. A knock at the door startled her. It was Evelyn, her mother, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond the recent turmoil. She carried a small, worn, leather-bound book. "I found this," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the ornate Persian rug. "In the attic. Your grandfather's journal." Alexandra took the book, its leather cool against her skin. The weight of it, both physical and emotional, was immense. It felt like a key, unlocking a door to a past she'd only glimpsed in fragmented memories and whispered accusations. He wrote about everything, Evelyn said, her voice cracking. The truth, about the foundation of our wealth. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. I wanted to protect you, but I was wrong. Alexandra opened the journal, the brittle pages whispering secrets long buried. The elegant script detailed a story far darker than she'd imagined. A tale of exploitation and betrayal, stretching back generations. The words blurred through her tears, each sentence a fresh wound. The past she tried to outrun was catching up, not with vengeance, but with a desperate plea for understanding. I understand, Alexandra finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. The words, simple yet profound, held the weight of years of unspoken resentments and newly found empathy. The cold isolation of the past few days began to thaw, replaced by a fragile, unexpected connection. The book, a tangible link to the past, felt less like a weapon and more like a bridge. A long, arduous journey lay ahead, but for the first time since the trial, a flicker of hope ignited in the darkness. The fight for healing had truly begun. The courtroom's sterile air hung heavy with the finality of the verdict. Alexandra, though vindicated, felt strangely hollow. The judge's gavel had fallen, silencing the cacophony of the trial, but the echoes of the past reverberated within her. The crisp, starched fabric of her suit felt like a suffocating shroud. Outside, the city throbbed with a life she'd been excluded from, a life she was only now beginning to understand. Sunlight, harsh and unforgiving, glinted off the chrome of passing cars. Daniel's hand, warm and reassuring, found hers. His touch anchored her to the present, a lifeline in the turbulent sea of emotions she was navigating. It's over, Alex, he said, his voice a gentle balm against her raw nerves. You won. She managed a weak smile, the gesture feeling alien and strained. Won? She echoed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. The victory felt pyrrhic, a hollow triumph achieved at a devastating cost. Her family, fractured and irrevocably changed, was a landscape of ruins. The following weeks were a blur of legal paperwork, media interviews, and attempts to rebuild her life from the rubble. The penthouse remained untouched, a silent testament to the life she'd left behind. Sleep offered little solace. Nightmares replayed the trial, the accusations, the betrayal. Each morning, she woke with the unshakable weight of the past pressing down on her. One rainy afternoon, she found herself at the city park. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of her former life. A lone bench, shrouded in the misty drizzle, offered a sanctuary. Sitting there, watching children splash in puddles, a wave of unexpected calm washed over her. The laughter of the children, innocent and carefree, was a poignant reminder of a life she'd almost lost. It was a life she was determined to reclaim, not as the daughter of Arthur Beaumont, but as Alexandra, a woman finally free to define herself. The future stretched before her, an uncharted territory filled with both fear and exhilarating possibility. The rain continued to fall, washing away the lingering dust of the past, leaving behind the promise of a new dawn. The legal battles concluded, leaving a residue of exhaustion more profound than triumph. Alexandra stared out at the city skyline, a million pinpricks of light blurring through the rain-streaked window of her new apartment. A small, unassuming space a world away from the Beaumont penthouse. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of the past year. The scent of brewing coffee, faint and comforting, did little to dispel the lingering chill in her heart. Daniel arrived bearing takeout containers and a hesitant smile. I thought you might need some fuel, he said, his voice soft. She managed a weak smile, the gesture still feeling unfamiliar. Thank you, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The emptiness was a constant companion, a hollow ache that no amount of vindication could fill. He settled beside her, the warmth of his presence a fragile anchor in the storm of her emotions. It's over, Alex, he repeated, his voice a quiet reassurance. But the weight of it all remained. The memories, the opulent parties, the stifled laughter, the carefully constructed lies were etched into her soul. "It feels incomplete," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. Like a chapter ended, but the book remains open, waiting for the next line. He reached for her hand, his touch grounding and reassuring. "The next line is yours to write, Alex. You've earned the right to write your own story." His words offered a sliver of hope, a tentative ray of light piercing the darkness. The rain continued to fall, a gentle rhythm accompanying the unspoken understanding between them. The city lights twinkled, promising a future as yet unwritten, but filled with the possibility of a new beginning. A future where Alexandra was free to define her happiness on her own terms. A future that held the promise of peace and a love that was not conditional upon wealth or lineage. A future simply her own. The courtroom's sterile air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and unspoken tension. The gavel's final thud echoed in Alexandra's ears, a jarring punctuation marked to months of relentless legal battles. Victory felt less like triumph, more like a weary sigh of relief. The judge's words, officially declaring the Beaumont family's fraudulent practices, remained a distant hum in her mind, overshadowed by a profound exhaustion. Outside, the city roared, a cacophony of horns and sirens, a stark contrast to the quiet hum of the courtroom. Daniel waited, his face etched with a mixture of relief and concern. He pulled her into a hug, the warmth of his body a temporary shield against the chilling emptiness that threatened to engulf her. "It's over, Alex," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Alexandra managed a weak smile, a ghost of her former self. The opulent penthouse, once a symbol of her gilded cage, now felt like a distant, hazy memory. This new apartment, small and unpretentious, held the scent of fresh paint and a faint hint of hope. But the hollow ache remained, a constant reminder of the life she'd left behind. That night, nestled amongst the soft cotton of her sheets, the city's lights twinkling like distant stars, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The victory was hollow. The truth had been exposed, but the chasm between her and her family remained. Her mother's tearful apology, a fragile bridge thrown across a turbulent river, felt insufficient. Her father's stony silence, a monument to unforgiveness, was a constant ache in her heart. "I miss them," she confessed to Daniel, the words escaping in a shaky whisper. Daniel's hand found hers, his touch a silent promise of comfort. "You miss the idea of them, Alex, not the reality." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The people you thought they were never real." His words, though true, didn't ease the pain. The memories, the glittering galas, the forced smiles, the suffocating expectations, clawed at her, a relentless tide threatening to pull her under. Yet, amidst the wreckage of her past, a small seed of something new was taking root. A quiet strength bloomed, nurtured by her newfound independence and the unwavering support of Daniel. The future remained unwritten, a blank page promising both uncertainty and possibility. A future where she could define her own happiness, free from the gilded cage of her birthright. The rain outside had stopped. A gentle dawn was breaking, hinting at a new day, a new beginning. The legal battles concluded, leaving behind a residue of dust and disillusionment. Alexandra stared out from her small apartment window, the city lights a glittering tapestry against the deepening twilight. The victory felt distant, muted by the echoes of loss. The penthouse, once a symbol of suffocating opulence, now felt like a dream, unreal and oddly distant. The scent of fresh paint, once a promise of hope, now held the faint tang of loneliness. Daniel entered, carrying takeout containers and a weary smile. "I know it's not celebratory sushi," he said softly, placing the food on the small kitchen table. The aroma of ginger and soy sauce momentarily lifted the oppressive weight of her solitude. Alexandra managed a weak smile. "It's perfect." She wasn't hungry, but the simple act of sharing a meal with Daniel felt like a lifeline in the churning sea of her emotions. He watched her, his gaze full of unspoken empathy. "You look tired." "Tired is an understatement," she admitted, her voice raw. "It's like waking from a long, bad dream, but the dream's still clinging to me." She picked at her food, the chopsticks feeling foreign in her hands. "The dream is over, Alex. You woke up." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You won. You faced them, exposed them, and you survived." Tears welled in her eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and a fragile hope. But at what cost? She looked down at their intertwined hands, the warmth a small comfort against the chilling emptiness that still gnawed at her. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the city's distant murmur. The legal victory felt hollow, a hollow shell that left her emotionally hollowed out. She had exposed the truth, but the truth had left gaping wounds in its wake. The family she once knew was fractured, irrevocably changed. The silence was a heavy cloak of unspoken anxieties and lingering uncertainties. The future, though bright with the promise of a new beginning, remained an unknown path awaiting its exploration. The scent of lilies, sharp and artificial, clashed with the earthy aroma of rain-soaked pavement filtering through the open window of her small apartment. Alexandra traced the condensation on the glass, mirroring the icy film clinging to her heart. The legal victory felt like a Pyrrhic triumph, a hollow shell devoid of satisfaction. Daniel, sensing her unease, sat beside her, his hand gently covering hers. "Evelyn called," he said quietly, his voice a soothing balm against the storm raging within her. "She wants to see you." Alexandra pulled her hand away, a tremor running through her. "No," she breathed, the word a whisper lost in the city's hum. "I can't." The memory of her mother's carefully constructed lies, her practiced facade of serene composure, felt like a fresh wound. "It's not an easy conversation," Daniel acknowledged, his gaze understanding. "But she's different now, broken like the rest of us." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She understands. She regrets it all." The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the window pane. Alexandra closed her eyes, picturing her mother's face, the mask of elegance finally cracking, revealing a woman ravaged by guilt and regret. A flicker of something, a fragile ember of hope, ignited within her. "She said she wants to apologize," Daniel continued softly, his words gently nudging her towards a difficult decision. "For everything." Alexandra opened her eyes, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. The bitter taste of betrayal still lingered, but a new flavor was emerging, a hint of forgiveness, hesitant but present. The weight of her anger, once an unyielding burden, felt slightly lighter. "Tell her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell her I'll think about it." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with unspoken anxieties. It held a space for healing, a tentative beginning. The rain, finally easing, seemed to mirror the slow, tentative softening of her heart. The courtroom's sterile scent of antiseptic and old wood clung to Alexandra like a second skin. The final gavel, a sharp crack in the echoing silence, marked not just the end of the legal battle, but a chapter in her life. She felt strangely empty, the adrenaline rush replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Outside, the city thrummed with a life she was only just beginning to re-enter. The crisp autumn air, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth, offered a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom. Daniel's hand found hers, his touch a familiar comfort. "It's over," he murmured, his voice husky with relief. He squeezed her hand, his eyes mirroring the storm of emotions swirling within her. The victory was bittersweet. The truth had been revealed, justice served, but at what cost? That evening found them in a small, dimly lit Italian restaurant, the air thick with the aroma of garlic, basil, and simmering tomato sauce. The flickering candlelight danced on Daniel's face, highlighting the worry lines etched around his eyes. He watched her, his gaze tender yet concerned, as she picked listlessly at her pasta. "You're quiet," he observed gently. Alexandra sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken burdens. "I feel adrift," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper above the low murmur of conversations around them. "Like I've won a battle but lost the war." "You haven't lost anything," Daniel countered, his voice firm but soft. "You've gained something far more valuable. Your truth, your voice, yourself." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But at what cost? My family, it's shattered. Some bonds were never worth saving," he responded, his voice laced with quiet conviction. "The ones that matter will find a way to mend." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. The simple gesture held a depth of meaning that transcended words. In the shared silence, a quiet understanding bloomed, a silent acknowledgement of the long, arduous journey ahead, a shared hope for a future where healing was possible. The warmth of his hand, the comforting weight of his gaze, offered a glimmer of hope amidst the wreckage of her past. The pasta remained untouched, a symbolic representation of the appetite for life she was slowly beginning to rediscover. The future, though uncertain, held the promise of a new beginning, a chance to build a life based on truth and authenticity. The city lights outside flickered, a silent testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The following weeks were a blur of legal paperwork and hushed phone calls. Alexandra felt the city's pulse, a frantic rhythm of sirens and hurried footsteps, mirroring the chaos within her. The penthouse, once a symbol of suffocating privilege, now felt hollow, a mausoleum to a life she'd left behind. Even the scent of her mother's favorite lilies, usually so comforting, now felt cloying, a reminder of the lies that had blossomed in that opulent space. One crisp morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. Daniel arrived, bearing coffee, the aroma a welcome intrusion into her solitude. He found her staring out at the cityscape, a solitary figure silhouetted against the panoramic view. "How are you?" he asked softly, his voice a gentle counterpoint to the city's relentless hum. Alexandra shrugged, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I'm processing. It's like waking up from a long, terrible dream, but the lingering effects remain." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the city lights, both bright and distant. "The victory feels hollow. I've exposed the truth, but the price, it's steep." He sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. The warmth of his touch was a lifeline in the sea of her grief. "You did what was right," he said, his voice firm, reassuring. "You fought for truth, even when it meant sacrificing everything you knew." "But what do I have left?" she whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "My family ruined, my identity shattered." He pulled her close, offering a silent embrace. "You have yourself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And you have me." His words, simple yet profound, cut through the fog of her despair. The promise of his presence, the quiet weight of his understanding, was the first seedling of healing in the barren landscape of her soul. The city lights, once a symbol of her gilded cage, now seemed to shimmer with a newfound hope, the hope that even amidst the ruins, a new beginning could bloom. The legal battles concluded, leaving a residue of exhaustion and a strange, hollow victory. Alexandra stood on the balcony of her now empty penthouse, the city a glittering tapestry below. The crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks, a stark contrast to the simmering anger that still pulsed beneath her skin. She hadn't contacted her mother since the trial, the silence a thick, suffocating blanket. The chasm between them felt unbridgeable, a testament to the lies that had woven their lives together. A soft knock on the door startled her. It was Daniel, his face etched with concern. He carried a single, perfect red rose, its velvety petals a splash of vibrant color against the muted tones of his coat. "I brought you this," he said, his voice low. "It's a survivor, you know, bloomed despite the frost." Alexandra managed a weak smile. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the rose, its fragrance, subtly sweet and sharp, was a welcome intrusion into the stale air of her grief. She traced the delicate curve of a petal with a fingertip, the act almost meditative in its stillness. "I spoke with Evelyn," Daniel said, his gaze unwavering. She's struggling. She wants to see you." Alexandra's breath hitched. The thought of facing her mother again, of confronting the years of deception, sent a shiver down her spine. But a flicker of something, perhaps hope, perhaps desperation, ignited within her. I don't know," she said, her voice barely audible. The weight of their fractured relationship pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. "She's not expecting forgiveness," Daniel said gently. "Just understanding, a chance to begin to heal." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to go, Alexandra, but you deserve to find some peace." His words were a lifeline, pulling her from the depths of her sorrow.